winter of 1911, prosecutors in a New York City courtroom presented a heavily charred piece of hardware into evidence, a solid brass deadbolt, recovered from the debris, with its latch still extended firmly into the strike plate. That single artifact belonged to the ninth-floor stairway door of the Asch building, an imposing structure standing at the corner of Washington Place and Green Street in Manhattan. Minutes before closing time on Saturday, March 25th, roughly 500 workers were finishing their shift across the building's top 3 floors. The overwhelming majority were young immigrant women and teenage girls from Jewish and Italian households, some as young as 14, who had crossed the Atlantic to support their families. Inside the Triangle Waist Company, they earned piece-rate wages, assembling the quintessential garment of modern working women, the tailored cotton blouse known as the shirtwaist. Completed in 1901, the 10-story Asch building was celebrated as an architectural marvel of its era, a certified fireproof loft. Its steel skeleton and terracotta floors were engineered to withstand intense heat without collapsing. But inside that fireproof shell, industrial production operated under combustible conditions. The long production tables were piled with long cotton, tissue paper patterns hung suspended from ceiling wires, and barrels of discarded fabric scraps sat beneath the cutting benches. At roughly 4:40 that afternoon, as bells signaled the end of the work week, a sudden flare ignited in a scrap bin on the 8th floor. Fed by hundreds of pounds of fabric cuttings, the flames surged across the open room in seconds, leaping upward through window bays and ventilation shafts into the crowded floor above. For the seamstresses on the 9th floor, the exits vanished almost instantly. The Green Street stairwell quickly choked with black smoke, and the elevators could only carry a fraction of the workforce. When dozens of panic-stricken workers surged toward the Washington Place doorway, their fastest route to street level, they discovered the heavy oak door would not open. The handle turned freely, but the deadbolt held fast. By sunset, 146 garment workers were dead. Yet the building's exterior walls remained upright and structurally sound. How did one of New York's most modern factories become a lethal trap? And why were the doors locked against the very people operating its machines? To understand how 500 workers found themselves on the upper floors of the Asch building, one must examine the garment that transformed American retail at the turn of the 20th century. The shirtwaist was far more than a tailored cotton blouse. It was a cultural uniform. Paired with a simple dark skirt, it allowed millions of women entering the expanding modern workforce as typists, telephone operators, department store clerks, and teachers to dress practically without the restrictive layers of Victorian fashion. New York City was the uncontested capital of this industry, and the Triangle Waist Company stood at its pinnacle. Founded by Russian-Jewish immigrants Max Blanck and Isaac Harris, the enterprise grew from a modest sweatshop into an industrial powerhouse manufacturing over 1 million shirtwaists a year. Within the garment district, Harris and Blanck were known as the Shirtwaist Kings, celebrated in commercial circles for their ability to deliver high volume at competitive prices. The human engine of this production came almost entirely from the crowded tenement blocks of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Tens of thousands of young Jewish women fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire and Italian girls from southern agrarian provinces arrived in New York with needlework skills honed from early childhood. To maximize output, factory owners relied on an inside subcontracting system. Rather than employing every seamstress directly, the owners paid male master tailors a flat rate per bundle. These subcontractors then hired young immigrant girls to perform the high-speed, repetitive assembly. From their meager weekly wages, typically $5 to $8, management deducted charges for the needles they broke, the thread they used, and even the electric power running their machines. Shifts regularly stretched across 6 days, totaling 54 to 60 hours under intense supervision. Yet these workers were not merely passive subjects of the factory floor. In November 1909, mounting frustration over deductions, arbitrary dismissals, and lock-shop conditions led to the uprising of the 20,000, the largest strike by female workers in American history to that date. At a mass meeting inside Manhattan's Cooper Union, A 23-year-old seamstress named Clara Lemlich took the podium after weeks of enduring beatings on the picket lines. Speaking passionately in Yiddish, she called for an industry-wide general strike. For 11 freezing winter weeks, thousands of young women marched through the garment district, facing arrest and physical intimidation from hired guards. By February 1910, more than 300 manufacturers surrendered and signed contracts with Local 25 of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, granting a 52-hour workweek, wage increases, and safety oversight. Triangle was not among them. Harris and Blanck helped organize rival manufacturers to hold the line, deploying private security to resist the union's demands. While they eventually granted modest wage concessions to restart production, they flatly refused to recognize the union or permit shop floor safety committees. Triangle remained an open shop. This victory of ownership over collective bargaining ensured that every internal regulation remained entirely in the hands of management. And inside the Asch building, the drive for speed and theft prevention was about to collide with the physical limits of the workplace. To understand why the Asch building became a lethal enclosure, one must examine the physical geography and daily machinery of its upper floors. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th Mayan, and 10th stories, each providing roughly 10,000 square feet of open loft space designed for high-density garment manufacturing. On the 8th floor, where raw yardage was processed, master cutters worked over wooden benches stretching 75 feet in length. Here, workers layered sheer lawn cotton up to 120 plies thick, using heavy shears and rotary knives to slice through the dense stacks. Suspended directly overhead, hundreds of tissue paper patterns hung from wires strung across the ceiling, swaying in the warm drafts of the room. Beneath the cutting tables sat wooden bins packed with discarded remnants, hundreds of pounds of combustible cotton scraps that accumulated across the 6-day workweek, waiting for collection by scrap dealers. One floor above, on the 9th floor, 240 operators worked in conditions of intense mechanical concentration. Seamstresses sat shoulder to shoulder along 8 long rows of double-sided tables. Beneath these work surfaces ran continuous steel drive shafts connected to central electric motors, driving hundreds of Singer power sewing machines simultaneously. At peak capacity, these needles hammered at nearly 3,000 stitches per minute. The air carried a steady haze of airborne lint. The floorboards beneath the tables were saturated with machine oil from lubrication pans, and wicker baskets overflowing with finished wastes crowded the narrow 18-inch aisles between workstations. This dense arrangement of machines, fabric, and oil was governed by a strict discipline of property control. Triangle produced thousands of garments weekly, and management operated under constant vigilance against petty theft. The owners feared that seamstresses might conceal spools of thread, scrap lace, or finished shirtwaists in their clothing. To prevent inventory loss, the factory floor was engineered as an architectural bottleneck. When the closing whistle sounded, workers were not permitted to disperse through every available exit. Instead, the company channeled the entire workforce toward a single monitored checkpoint at the Green Street doorway. There, beside the freight elevator shafts, a watchman stood behind a narrow wooden barrier, searching the purses and pockets of every young woman before granting access to the stairway. On the opposite side of the floor, the exit leading to the Washington Place stairway served an entirely different purpose in management's daily oversight. To ensure that no employee bypassed the search station, arrived late unrecorded, or slipped out early, the heavy oak door leading to the Washington Place stairs was routinely locked from the outside. The key remained in the pocket of a floor foreman. Crucially, the door opened inward toward the shop floor, requiring anyone attempting to exit to pull against the flow of whatever crowd gathered behind them. At approximately 4:40 that Saturday afternoon, the closing bell signaled the end of the shift across the 8th floor. Seamstresses cut their final threads, stacked their piecework bundles, and reached for their coats. Around the 8th floor cutting tables, workers began sweeping fabric clippings into the bins. Within seconds, A spark met the dry lawn cotton beneath the tables, igniting an environment engineered for maximum output but devoid of rapid escape. When the first flames flared on the 8th floor, workers attempted to extinguish them using water pails hanging along the walls. The water had no effect on the fast-burning cotton fabric. An employee uncoiled the interior fire hose connected to the building's standpipe, but when he turned the valve, no water flowed. The rooftop reservoir was either unpressurized or disconnected. On the 8th floor, the telephone operator, Dinah Leifschitz, managed to alert the 10th floor executive offices before fleeing. Isaac Harris, Max Blanck, and roughly 70 administrative personnel and workers escaped upward onto the roof. There, students and Professor Frank Sommer from the adjacent New York University Law School reached across the roofline, lowering ladders to pull dozens of people to safety. Yet no alarm or telephone call ever reached the 240 seamstresses on the 9th floor. They only realized the building was ablaze when smoke began pouring through the floorboards and sheets of flame shattered the exterior windows facing the courtyard. With the Washington Place doorway bolted shut, workers crowded toward the 2 narrow passenger elevators on the Green Street side. Operating in choking smoke, 2 young elevator attendants, 19-year-old Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortallalo, made 3 desperate round trips up to the 9th floor. On each descent, they packed 30 to 40 frantic workers into the small iron cages. By the 4th ascent, intense heat warped the elevator shaft rails, jamming the machinery and leaving the remaining workforce with no mechanical escape. At the rear of the building, over 20 workers crowded onto the exterior iron fire escape hanging over the inner courtyard. It was never designed to hold the weight of an entire shift. Under the strain, the rusted iron brackets tore loose from the masonry, collapsing the entire metal structure and sending those on it falling into the paved court below. Down on the street, units of the New York Fire Department arrived under the direction of Fire Chief Edward Croker within minutes of the first alarm. Firefighters raised their newest, state-of-the-art aerial turntable ladders. But even when extended to their maximum height, the ladders reached only to the 6th floor, nearly 30 feet below the windowsills where trapped seamstresses stood. Firemen trained high-pressure hose lines upward, but the water streams disintegrated into fine mist before reaching the upper stories. Below the windows, firefighters stretched heavy canvas life nets. The momentum of falls from 80 to 90 feet above instantly tore through the nets and pulled the men holding them to the pavement. Within 18 minutes, the combustible materials on the 8th and 9th floors burned themselves out. Firefighters working their way up the Green Street stairwell extinguished the remaining embers and forced open the doors. Behind the Washington Place exit, they found the grim proof of the locked passage. A dense cluster of victims who had piled against an inward swinging door that never opened. In the days following March 25th, an estimated 350,000 people marched in silence through the rain along 5th Avenue, following empty black hearses to honor the unidentified dead. Public outrage immediately converged on the courts. In April 1911, a grand jury indicted Isaac Harris and Max Blanck on charges of first- and second-degree manslaughter. The trial began that December in the New York County Court of General Sessions. The prosecution built its case upon a direct statute, Section 80 of the New York State Labor Law, which explicitly mandated that all factory doors shall open outwardly where practicable and shall not be locked, bolted, or fastened during working hours. Assistant District Attorney Charles Bostwick entered the charred Washington Place lock into evidence, arguing that the owners maintained a deliberate policy of keeping the exit secured to prevent the theft of scrap fabric. Survivor Kate Alterman delivered crucial testimony, recounting her attempt to escape the 9th floor as flames cut off the room. "I tried to open the door, and I couldn't move it. The door was locked, and I shoved and I pushed it, but it wouldn't open." Defense attorney Max Stoyer countered with a calculated cross-examination. He asked Alterman to repeat her account 3 times. When her testimony repeated nearly word for word, Stoyer argued to the all-male jury that her statement had been coached by prosecutors rather than recalled from memory. On December 27th, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. The trial judge had instructed the jurors that to convict, the state had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Harrison Blanck possessed personal, direct knowledge that the specific exit door was locked when the fire broke out. The financial aftermath deepened the public sense of injustice. Following the disaster, insurance adjusters paid the Triangle Waste Company over $64,000 for property and inventory losses, a payout that yielded an estimated profit of roughly $60 per casualty above actual manufacturing damage. When civil wrongful death suits were settled in 1914, surviving families received $75 per lost relative. Yet the failure of the criminal trial redirected public grief into institutional reform. Frances Perkins, an activist who had watched the fire unfold from Washington Square, later described March 25th as the day the New Deal began. Perkins joined the newly created New York State Factory Investigating Commission, working alongside state legislators Robert F. Wagner and Alfred E. Smith to conduct a comprehensive audit of industrial safety. Between 1911 and 1915, the commission inspected nearly 2,000 factories across New York State. Their findings led directly to the passage of 36 landmark statutes that remade American labor standards. The new laws required automatic sprinkler systems in multi-story lofts, mandated fireproof stairwells, outlawed inward opening exit doors, and established enforceable occupancy limits tied directly to exit width. The locked door on the 9th floor had finally forced the law to intervene where private management had failed. Today, the corner of Washington Place and Green Street looks remarkably unchanged. The 10-story structure that once housed the Triangle Waste Company still stands, integrated into the urban campus of New York University as the Brown Building of Science. Students and researchers pass daily through the ground-floor archways. Walking across the same threshold where hundreds of citizens once gathered in shock. For nearly a century, the human ledger of the disaster remained incomplete. While most victims were buried by grieving families across New York and New Jersey, 6 young women could not be identified from the charred remains in 1911 and were laid to rest beneath a shared stone monument in Brooklyn's Cemetery of the Evergreens. It was not until 2011, through 6 years of exhaustive genealogical and archival research by independent historian Michael Hirsch, that those final 6 names, including 14-year-old Rosaria Maltese, were recovered and restored to the official roll. All 146 names are now fully accounted for. The institutional changes set in motion by the catastrophe rippled far beyond Manhattan. When Frances Perkins was appointed United States Secretary of Labor in 1933, becoming the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, she carried the lessons of the Asch building into national policy. The minimum wage provisions, 40-hour workweek restrictions, child labor prohibitions, and industrial safety mandates codified during the New Deal and later formalized under the Occupational Safety and Health Act trace their regulatory lineage directly to the ashes of the 9th floor. In the autumn of 2023, a permanent memorial was dedicated on the building's limestone facade. A continuous steel ribbon, etched with the names and ages of every victim, descends from the 9th floor window line to the street level, reflecting daylight onto polished stone panels textured with the weave of cotton and lace. Every time an emergency door swings outward at the push of a crash bar, every time an illuminated exit sign marks an unblocked stairwell, and every time an automatic sprinkler system monitors a factory floor, we inhabit an industrial environment shaped by the workers of March 25, 1911. They were not abstract symbols of tragedy. They were skilled seamstresses, master cutters, and young immigrants earning an honest wage to build a future in a new country. When you walk through the exits of your workplace today, consider the invisible codes written into every hinge and hallway. Which forgotten chapters of labor and craftsmanship shape the everyday protections you rely on?